We learned in the first lesson that we live in an empire based on debt. So now we need to explore how debt exerts power and control. This will challenge many preconceived notions of Economics 101. I think most of what we think about economics is completely wrong. In this lesson, we'll reveal how the notion of a free market is an illusion. We saw this diagram in lesson 1 showing the government off to the side, not really part of the pyramid. So what really governs this system? It's the bond market. So the first thing to note is that this basically means the stock market's irrelevant. Even though it's the focus of every nightly news program, it's just a distraction from what really matters when it comes to understanding power in this empire. The stock market is dwarfed by the bond market and all the other international markets for debt instruments. That's what a bond is. It's a debt instrument. It gives the owner a claim on an underlying asset or organization. Now, that might be a company, a state, or a country, but those things are just groups of people. So at the end of the day, these bonds give the owners a claim on people. It gives them a claim on the value created by the people today and in the future. So people's labor is in effect owned by the bondholders. And the people who are under the bond's control are forced to work in order to pay it off. And that's because there are always more of these bonds in the system than dollars. There's always more debt than money. In fact, there is no money in this system unless the country is in debt. And you can see this by just looking at the Fed's balance sheet. You'll always see more bonds than Federal Reserve notes or dollar bills. This does two critical things. One, it puts the entire country in a state of scarcity that forces the population to basically jump on the hamster wheel. And two, it forces the population to have to go to commercial banks to get more money because there will otherwise never be enough money to pay off the debt. This is the beauty of this cartel system from the perspective of the bankers. The Fed is able to keep the U.S. government in a servitude relationship based on scarcity, which then forces about 310 million people to be customers of the commercial banks in order to have money. Brilliant. And that's where money comes from today. It's just electronic digits sitting in banks. It does not come from the U.S. government. Now, most of these bonds are sitting on the balance sheet of the Fed and commercial banks and other financial institutions like the Bank of China and the Bank of Japan. So let's be clear what this means. The productive value of the American population's labor is owned by financial institutions, and most of it happens to be owned by foreign institutions today. And then a large part is also owned by rich, connected individuals in a complex array of financial LLCs, capital firms, and equity partnerships. This means that almost the entire population is working, spinning on the hamster wheel, to pay the owners of these bonds. And that's an extremely powerful wealth-generating upward force within this pyramid system. Wealth moves up the pyramid. This is what I meant by Hamiltonian vertical forces in the previous lesson. Now, this means it's also a very powerful downward force in terms of power and control. The owners of those bonds have top-down power and control over everything else in the system. They have leverage, basically. In financial academic circles, debt is discussed as a means of building leverage or of gaining control over an underlying asset. This became famous in the hostile takeover days of the 80s, but leverage always exists over all the assets in our system and still does today. Whether that's a multinational corporation or a small business or nonprofits like schools and churches, families are controlled by the bond market. In fact, most people in the world are controlled by the bond market in ways they aren't aware of. State governments are controlled by it, and of course the U.S. government itself in Washington, D.C. is controlled by the power of the bond market. This means organizations like the police and military are influenced by the bond market and these bondholders because every organization needs money, and all money comes from these bonds. Power and control is established by the bond market's hierarchical debt system. The lower you go in this pyramid, the higher the cost of money. So the Fed issues money for free. Cartel banks create money for minimal cost, depending on the Fed's policy, which is right now less than 1%. And then each layer of this pyramid has to pay more in order to get money, to the point where individuals at the bottom have to pay around 29% in this current market for credit card money. On the flip side, this means the availability of money goes down as you go down the pyramid. The Fed has almost no limit because its cost is zero, and the further down you go, the less money is available. About the only way for individuals to get money at the bottom is by working for one of the other layers, which is again the issue of scarcity. Individual people have no money because it's so scarce that they must get a job with a big institution. And the higher their job in the pyramid, the more money they'll make. This isn't because they'll be creating more value. On the contrary, most of the people creating real value in the economy, like farmers and assembly line workers, make very little money. The reason people make more money in the higher rungs of the pyramid is because higher layers have more power and control, given this monetary system. They have what's called seigniorage because they're closer to the ownership layers, so the cost of money is lower to them, and money is drawn to the lowest cost, so these layers have more money. Now, all of this means you're effectively governed day to day by these people. These are the big bond trading desks at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, UBS, Deutsche Bank, the Fed, the Bank of China. Their collective action determines who gets money, and therefore who has power. Again, these people govern the world on a day-to-day basis, while the people at the top of the pyramid govern it on a strategic basis. They tweak the system over time to change the incentives for these bond traders, which ripples all the way down to you and me in very powerful ways. We saw this in 2008 very clearly when the actions of these people, based on the crazy policies of these people, caused a near global meltdown. But they have just as much power and control in normal times because they have all the leverage. So here's a question. Is this a wealth generation system, as we're trained to think? Well, it certainly is for these people. But if it is for everything else in the system, then why is the United States stuck with what's up to around $100 trillion in debt and total unfunded liabilities? Well, it's because this isn't a wealth generation system instead, but it's a debt generation system, which is really clear for these lower layers that are bankrupt. It's less clear for these middle layers because even though the institutions are driven by debt, the people in them can accumulate wealth given their high salaries and commissions and bonuses since they're dutifully serving in the upper layers of this empire system. Now here's another question. Does this sound like a free market? Does it facilitate freedom? Again, it certainly does for the top, but for the other layers, this is a servitude system. This is hard for many in the middle class to detect because as the system inflates, they feel free because they accumulate money and they're able to work and buy things. But they seem to ignore the accumulating debt. And they also ignore the lower layers that are clearly in servitude, like the less developed countries that are co-opted into this system, like those John Perkins describes in his book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Even for most of the rich guys in the upper middle layers, like Wall Street and the multinationals, they only get their money because they're serving the controllers. Many of them have to work 80-hour work weeks to get their money. Are they free? And this brings us to more flaws of neoclassical economics. It completely ignores the issue of our money being nothing but debt, which is like ignoring that the sky is blue when you walk outside. It ignores the artificiality of the scarcity condition, and it takes it as a given rather than trying to imagine what another system might look like. It equates net worth with value creation. It assumes a rich guy must have created a lot of value, but we know that's a complete fiction. And it erroneously assumes everyone is a rational, free, equal person within the system by ignoring the power differential caused by the fact that our money is nothing but debt. So, what do you think of this system? Do you still believe we live in a free market? We'll dig further into this question in the next lesson as we discuss the issue of ownership.